There is a building in Erith, Kent, that most people drive past without a second glance. The brickwork has weathered into a color somewhere between rust and bruise, the kind of red that English winters dull into something almost apologetic. The signage is gone, prized off years ago, leaving only the ghost marks where letters once spelled out a name that mattered. The car park, once full of the cars of engineers, cabinet makers, electronics specialists, and the apprentices who carried tea between them, is empty now, cracked through with weeds that have learned to thrive on neglect. If you pressed your face to one of the surviving windows on a still afternoon, you might convince yourself you could still hear it, that faint, low, almost subterranean hum that musicians around the world once chased across continents. The sound of a Vox amplifier warming up. The sound of British music finding its voice. That sound is gone now. Not faded, not diminished. Gone from the building, gone from the town, gone from the country that invented it. And the strange, painful truth is that the company which created it, the company that gave the Beatles their stage volume, gave the Rolling Stones their snarl, gave the Kinks their fuzz, gave Queen their stadium roar, gave Britain itself a sonic identity that traveled further than any flag, that company collapsed not once, but again and again across 4 decades. Each collapse stripped away another piece of what it had been. Each rescue was a smaller rescue than the last. Each new owner promised to restore it, and each new owner, in their own way, failed. This is the story of how Britain invented the sound of modern music, sold it, lost it, bought it back, and lost it again. It is the story of Vox, and it is a story that ends not with a single dramatic bankruptcy, but with something quieter and, in its way, more devastating. The slow, deliberate offshoring of a craft that had once been one of the country's quiet glories. The bankruptcy of intention, the bankruptcy of memory, the bankruptcy of a country that stopped believing the work was worth keeping at home. Why this mattered. To understand what was destroyed, you have to understand what Vox was before the collapse, and Vox was never simply an amplifier company. It was a translator. It took the raw electrical pulse of a guitar pickup and turned it into something that could fill a theater, then a ballroom, then a stadium, then a generation. Without Vox, the British invasion of the 1960s does not happen as it happened. The Beatles play smaller rooms, the Stones sound thinner, the whole sonic shape of pop music, that bright, chiming, slightly broken up tone that defined an era, does not exist in the form we know it. There is a temptation when speaking about cultural icons to overstate their importance. With Vox, the temptation runs the other way. The company has been so absorbed into the background of 20th century music that its specific contribution has become almost invisible, the way a well-built foundation becomes invisible to the people walking on the floor above. Take the foundation away and the building falls. Take Vox out of the story of British music and the story collapses into something unrecognizable. Vox mattered because it was one of the rare moments when British engineering, British design, and British musical taste arrived at the same table at the same time and produced something the rest of the world had to copy. The AC30, a 30-watt valve amplifier built in a wooden cabinet in Dartford, became and remains one of the 3 or 4 most important amplifiers ever made. American engineers studied it, Japanese engineers reverse engineered it, European boutique builders spent the next 60 years trying to recapture what its original designers had stumbled into almost by accident. The amplifier became a reference point, a benchmark, a target. Generations of younger designers have built their careers attempting to chase the ghost of what came out of a workshop in Kent in 1959. It mattered because at its peak it was an export industry that ran on craft. Each cabinet was assembled by hand. Each transformer was wound in-house.
Each amplifier was tested by an engineer who could tell by ear alone whether a circuit was singing correctly or whether something inside it was sulking. The factory floor in the 1960s employed hundreds of people in skilled trades: woodworkers, electronics technicians, quality inspectors, designers, transformer winders, finishers, testers. These were not assembly line jobs in the dehumanized sense. These were craft jobs. Apprenticeships were real apprenticeships. Knowledge was passed from one bench to the next, from one shift to the next, in the way that genuine industrial knowledge is passed, by hand, by ear, by example. And when the company fell, those crafts fell with it. It mattered too because Vox was a Southeast London story, not Manchester, not Sheffield, not the great industrial north, but the workshops and factories of Dartford and Erith, places that rarely feature in the national narrative of British industrial heritage, but which once produced something the entire world wanted to buy. There is a particular blindness in how Britain remembers its industrial past. The mills of Lancashire are remembered, the shipyards of the Clyde are remembered, the mines of South Wales are remembered, but the small, specialized, world-class manufacturing operations of the Southeast, the ones that produced precision instruments, electronics, scientific equipment, musical hardware, have largely slipped out of the national memory. Vox is one of those forgotten operations. When it collapsed, a piece of that quieter southern industrial Britain went with it, and almost nobody noticed. It mattered because of what its instruments did to people. There is a moment on certain Beatles recordings when the rhythm guitar suddenly opens out into a wide, sparkling jangle that seems to fill the whole stereo field. That sound is a Vox AC30 being pushed to the edge of its capabilities by an engineer who knew exactly what he was doing. There is a moment on certain Rolling Stones recordings when Keith Richards' guitar goes from clean to dangerous in the space of a single bar. That transition was made possible by Vox circuitry. There is a moment in the Queen catalog when Brian May's layered guitar harmonies climb into a register that no amplifier should reasonably be able to sustain. That climb was performed on a wall of AC30s. Take Vox out, and you do not just lose an amplifier, you lose a particular shape of sound that defined how millions of people first understood what a guitar could do.
So when we talk about the bankruptcy that destroyed Britain's greatest sound, we are not talking about a brand. We are talking about a craft, a workforce, a town, an export, and an entire chapter of British cultural identity. All of it tied to a wooden box with a brass diamond on the front. All of it, in the end, allowed to slip away. Origins and rise. The story begins in 1957 in a workshop in Dartford, Kent, with a man named Tom Jennings. Jennings was not a celebrity. He was not a rock star. He was a businessman with an accordion shop, a quick mind for trends, and a partnership with an electronics engineer named Dick Denny. Denny was the quieter half of the equation, a working engineer with a deep, intuitive understanding of how valves behaved when you pushed them, how transformers colored a signal, how a speaker cabinet could either liberate or strangle a tone. He played guitar himself, which mattered more than it might sound. The amplifiers he designed felt right under the fingers because they had been designed by someone who understood what fingers wanted from them. Together, in the Jennings Musical Industries premises, they began building amplifiers under a brand name borrowed from the Latin word for voice, Vox. The name was small, sharp, and easy to remember. It looked good on a logo. It felt modern in a way that the older British electronics names, with their long Victorian compound titles, no longer did. The post-war British music market was a strange place. Imported American equipment was difficult to obtain. Currency restrictions, import duties, and supply chain disruptions made a Fender amplifier a rare and expensive thing for a working British musician. Domestic equipment was available, but most of it was either too quiet, too fragile, or too genteel for the new generation of players who had heard rock and roll on the radio and wanted something that could keep up. Into that gap walked Vox with a product that was loud, durable, distinctively voiced, and built on British soil. The first AC15 appeared at a moment when British guitarists were looking for something British amplifiers could not yet give them. American Fenders were being smuggled in by working musicians, but they were rare, expensive, and built for a different aesthetic, cleaner, glassier, designed for a different musical conversation. British players wanted something with bite, with chime, with the ability to be heard over the increasingly loud audiences of the dance hall and ballroom circuit. The AC15 gave them 15 watts of valve-driven warmth, and it gave them a distinctive top-end shimmer that no other amplifier was producing. Bright, chiming, with a top-end shimmer that seemed to lift off the speaker and float across the room like a presence rather than a sound. The Shadows took it, then the Beatles took it, then everyone took it. There is a particular kind of historical luck involved in being the right product at the right moment. The AC30 arrived at the precise instant when British popular music was about to undergo its most explosive cultural transformation in a century. The new beat groups needed amplifiers. They needed amplifiers that were loud enough to be heard over their audiences, distinctive enough to give them a recognizable sound, reliable enough to survive a touring schedule that was about to become brutal, and visually striking enough to look right on television. Vox, almost by accident, met every one of those requirements at once. By 1963, Vox amplifiers were the default backdrop of British popular music. If you watch television footage of a beat group from that era, the chances were overwhelming that you were looking at a wall of Vox cabinets. The company had a contract with the Beatles that gave them visibility no advertising budget could have bought. The brass diamond logo became, in its quiet way, as recognizable as any badge in British manufacturing. The Beatles played Vox, the Stones played Vox, the Kinks played Vox, the Animals played Vox, the Yardbirds played Vox. To be a British beat group in 1963 was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, to stand in front of a wall of Vox amplifiers and play music that the rest of the world was about to lose its mind over. The Erith factory expanded. New product lines appeared. The Continental organ, with its reversed black and white keys that became a signature instrument of mid-60s pop. The Phantom guitar, with its famous pentagonal body. The teardrop-shaped Mark VI, played most famously by Brian Jones. The AC50, the AC100, built specifically to handle the impossibility of the Beatles' Shea Stadium concert. The Super Beatle, designed for the American market and the increasingly impossible demand for stage volume. Vox became briefly one of the most important music equipment manufacturers in the world. It's worth pausing here to register what that meant. A British company operating out of small premises in southeast London had become, in a matter of half a decade, a globally significant manufacturer. Its products were being shipped to every continent. Its name was being spoken in every language that pop music reached. Its instruments were appearing on the cover of every major music magazine. The people who built those instruments were watching on their own television sets the bands they had supplied playing on stages they had built the equipment for. There is a particular quiet pride that comes from that moment, and the men and women of Erith felt it. Peak power. The mid-1960s were Vox at full stretch. The factory at Erith was producing amplifiers in numbers that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. Export orders flowed to the United States, to Europe, to Japan, to Australia, to anywhere a British beat group had landed and inspired an imitation. The American distribution deal with the Thomas Organ Company, signed in 1964, opened a market that, on paper, should have made Vox unassailable. America was the largest music equipment market in the world. Securing a foothold there was the kind of commercial coup that British exporters had been trying and largely failing to pull off for a generation. The peak years carried a particular British confidence, the confidence of a company that had stumbled into a global moment and was riding it well. The workforce swelled. Apprentices came in from local schools, served their time at the bench, and graduated into the skilled trades that the factory required. Engineers were given the latitude to experiment, and the experiments produced some of the most distinctive instruments of the decade. The Phantom guitar, The Mark VI, the Continental organ, the various boutique experiments with built-in effects, with onboard tone modulators, with the kinds of features that would not become standard in the wider industry until a decade later.
Vox was no longer just an amplifier maker. It was a sonic ecosystem. A band could buy its guitars, its basses, its organs, and its amplifiers from a single British company, and that company's instruments would dominate the airwaves of half the world. To stand on a stage in 1965, surrounded by Vox equipment, was to declare a kind of allegiance to the British sound, and that allegiance was being declared by bands in California, in New York, in Tokyo, in Hamburg, in Sydney. The factory floor in those years was a place of genuine pride. There are former employees, interviewed decades later, who still describe the period with a particular light in their voice. The work was hard, the hours could be long, but there was a sense, almost universal, that what they were building mattered, that it would be heard by millions, that it would become part of the soundtrack of the era. Industrial work, when it carries that kind of meaning, becomes something other than labor. It becomes contribution. It becomes inheritance. But peaks in British industrial history are dangerous places. They produce overconfidence. They produce expansion that outruns the underlying business. They produce decisions made on the assumption that the curve will keep climbing, when in fact the curve is about to bend. Companies at their peak tend to commit to the kinds of investments, new factories, new product lines, new ventures into adjacent markets, that look reasonable on the way up and become catastrophic on the way down. Vox was no exception to this pattern. The company began to expand into product categories where its expertise was thinner. The organ business looked promising in the mid-60s when the Continental was finding favor with major bands, but it was a more crowded and competitive market than the amplifier market had been, and Vox's position in it was less secure than the company's leadership seemed to recognize. The guitar business was similarly uneven. The Phantom and the Mark VI were striking instruments, but they never displaced the established American brands in the way that Vox amplifiers had displaced the established British competitors. And by 1967, the curve had begun to flatten. How does a company with this much momentum, this much cultural capital, this much demand, find itself in trouble in the space of 2 or 3 years? The answer, when it comes, is not flattering. The answer is that British industrial success in the post-war decades was often more fragile than it looked. The capital base was thin. The management cultures were often parochial. The financial systems that should have supported sustained growth were not always equipped to do so. Companies grew quickly on the back of a single product or a single market opening, and then discovered growth without the infrastructure to support it was a particular kind of trap. The first cracks. The first cracks were not loud. They almost never are. The American distribution arrangement, which had looked like a triumph, began to reveal its complications. The Thomas Organ Company, in pursuit of cost savings and its own commercial logic, began producing solid-state versions of Vox amplifiers in the United States, amplifiers that bore the Vox name but did not sound like Vox amplifiers. Solid-state technology in the late 1960s was nowhere near the level it would eventually reach. The early transistor amplifiers were thin, harsh, and unforgiving. To a generation of American players, the Vox brand became associated with a sound that bore little resemblance to the warm valve chime of the Erith-built originals. The reputation, painstakingly built across half a decade of British craft, began to dilute in months. This was, in retrospect, one of the most damaging strategic errors in the company's history. The brand identity that Vox had built, the brand identity that had been bought, in effect, with thousands of hours of skilled British labor and the cultural endorsement of the most famous bands in the world, was being given away to a partner who did not share the company's commitments and did not understand the technical specifics of why Vox amplifiers sounded the way they did. A great deal of what made an AC30 an AC30 was not in the schematic. It was in the components, the layout, the build practices, the testing methodology, the small accumulated decisions of a particular factory culture. Strip those out, and you have an amplifier with a Vox badge on it that is not, in any meaningful sense, a Vox amplifier. Meanwhile, the British parent company was overextending. New product lines were launched that the market did not want. The organ business, which had seemed so promising, began to struggle as tastes shifted. The cost base of the Erith operation, skilled labor, hand assembly, in-house transformer winding, was high, and in a market that was beginning to fragment into cheaper imports and louder American rivals, high cost bases became dangerous. The economics that had supported the boom years were beginning to invert. What had looked like premium positioning in 1964 looked by 1968 like an unsustainable cost structure. There was also the broader British industrial context. The late 1960s were a period of mounting difficulty for British manufacturing in general. Sterling devaluation, inflation, industrial unrest, the slow erosion of the post-war consensus that had supported manufacturing investment. Vox was operating in an environment that was becoming more hostile to the kind of company it was, a small, specialized, craft-based manufacturer competing in a global market with rivals with deeper pockets and lower cost bases. By 1968, Jennings Musical Industries was in financial distress. The company was sold to the Royston Group, an industrial conglomerate that had no particular feeling for amplifiers, for music, or for the craft culture of the Erith factory. It was the first of many ownerships that would treat Vox as an asset rather than a vocation. And the difference between an asset and a vocation in industrial history turns out to be the difference between a company that survives its founders and a company that becomes a slowly eroding shell. The pattern was now set. The cracks were structural, not cosmetic. Tom Jennings, the founding figure, departed. Dick Denny, the engineer who had given the company its sonic identity, was increasingly marginalized. The institutional knowledge that had built the AC30 was being scattered, and the question that would haunt the next 4 decades was beginning to take shape. Who exactly was going to care about this company enough to save it?
The downfall. The 1970s were a long, slow erosion. Royston went into receivership. Vox was sold on, and then sold on again. Each transaction stripped away a little more of what the company had been. The Erith factory's workforce shrank. Skilled engineers left. The product range narrowed. The amplifiers themselves changed. Components were swapped for cheaper alternatives. Build quality drifted, and the magic that had once come out of Dick Denny's circuits began to feel in places like a memory rather than a current capability. This is one of the more painful chapters of the story, because it is the chapter in which the brand began to cannibalize itself. Each new owner inherited a name with extraordinary cultural weight, and each new owner discovered that the name could be used in the short term to sell amplifiers that were not, in any meaningful sense, the amplifiers the name had been built on. A cheap amplifier with a Vox badge would still sell, at least for a while, on the strength of the badge alone. But every cheap amplifier sold on that basis was a small withdrawal from a brand equity bank account that nobody was depositing into. Eventually, the account would run dry. The Dallas Arbiter Group acquired the brand, then CBS Arbiter. Each ownership brought its own approach, its own commercial logic, its own theory of how to make money out of an inherited name. Some of those approaches produced decent amplifiers. Others produced amplifiers that the original Vox engineers, had they been consulted, would not have signed off on. The product line drifted, expanded, contracted, drifted again.
Then Rose and Morris, the British distributor, took over in the late 1970s and attempted a partial restoration, moving production to a facility in Shoeburyness, Essex, and reissuing some of the classic models. There were good amplifiers built in this period. There were dedicated people trying to do justice to what Vox had been. The Shoeburyness operation produced AC30 reissues that some collectors still rate highly. But each rescue was a smaller rescue than the last, and each rescue operated under tighter financial constraints than the one before. The Shoeburyness factory was not Erith. The workforce was not the original workforce. The institutional culture that had produced the original AC30 had been broken so many times by then that what remained was less a continuation than a careful reconstruction. The 1980s brought further turbulence. Ownership changed again. The brand drifted. Production moved. The company was at one point absorbed into a larger holding structure. There were periods when it was not entirely clear who owned the rights to the Vox name in which territories, or what was being built where, or who was responsible for quality control. For a brand that once stood for a particular and unmistakable sound, this kind of fragmentation was poison. The killing blow, if any single moment can be called that, came in 1992. The brand was acquired by Korg, the Japanese electronics company. On paper, this was a rescue. Korg had the financial muscle, the manufacturing capability, and the global distribution to put Vox back on stages around the world. And in many respects, they did. The AC30 returned to production. New variants were developed. The brand survived. The name continued to appear on amplifiers used by working musicians. But survival is not the same as continuity. The British industrial operation, the Erith factory, the Dartford workshops, the local supply chain of cabinet makers and transformer winders was effectively finished. Production moved overseas, primarily to facilities in China and Vietnam. The amplifiers that now bear the Vox name are, in the main, well-made instruments produced in Asian factories under Japanese ownership, using a brand identity that was once forged in southeast London. The bankruptcy that destroyed Britain's greatest sound was not a single event. It was a slow, repeated bankruptcy of intention, a 4-decade process in which each successive owner cared a little less about the British roots of the company than the one before, and each successive restructuring moved the work a little further from the people and the place that had made it matter in the first place. There is a specific kind of corporate operation that makes this kind of erosion possible. It involves separating a brand from its means of production, then optimizing each separately. The brand is monetized by selling whatever can be sold under the name. The means of production are optimized by relocating to the lowest cost jurisdiction that can meet the basic technical specification. In the short term, this looks like rational management. In the long term, it produces a brand that no longer means what it used to mean, and a means of production that no longer carries the cultural weight that made the brand worth having.
Human and cultural cost. The numbers tell part of the story. At its peak, the Erith operation employed several hundred skilled trades. By the time the British manufacturing operation finally wound down, that figure collapsed to almost nothing. The skilled workforce, the woodworkers, the wirers, the testers, the engineers, dispersed. Some went to other British music equipment companies. Some left the industry altogether. Some retired earlier than they had planned. The skills they carried, accumulated over decades of hand building, did not transfer easily to other contexts. When a craft workforce is dispersed, it is not simply paused, it is, in many cases, ended. This is one of the least understood costs of British deindustrialization. The standard narrative tends to focus on the unemployment numbers, the headline figures about how many jobs were lost in a particular sector during a particular period. Those numbers matter, but they understate the deeper loss. A skilled worker who loses a job in a craft industry does not simply move into another job at the same skill level. Most often, they move into work that does not use the skills they spent decades acquiring. The skills, in effect, are deleted from the national capability. They cannot easily be brought back because the institutions that produced them, the apprenticeships, the workshop cultures, the chains of mentorship, have been broken. A factory is not just a building full of machines. A factory is a community of practice. It is a network of people who know how to do things together, who can teach the people coming up behind them, who carry the small accumulated wisdom of their trade in their hands and their habits. When you close a factory of that kind, you do not just close a building. You break a community of practice that may have taken decades or generations to build. And that breakage is, in many cases, irreversible. The cultural cost ran deeper. Vox had been one of the few British manufacturing names with genuine global recognition in a consumer market. It sat alongside a small handful of others: Burberry, Wedgwood, Rolls-Royce, Triumph, Norton, as names that meant something to people who had never been to Britain and probably never would. Its loss was not just an industrial loss, it was a loss of soft power, of cultural export, of the quiet pride that comes from knowing that the equipment behind the most famous music of the century had been built by your neighbors. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for industries that die slowly. A sudden closure produces shock, headlines, political response. The closure of a steelworks, the loss of a coal mine, the bankruptcy of a high street chain, these events produce immediate public attention, sometimes outrage, occasionally policy responses. A long erosion, by contrast, produces only a fading. By the time Vox's British manufacturing operation was effectively gone, there was no public outcry because there was no single moment to point to. The company had not died. It had simply stopped being British. There was no funeral. There was no press conference. There was no parliamentary debate. There was just a slow accumulation of decisions made in boardrooms over decades that ended with the work being done somewhere else by other people. The town of Erith bore the localized cost of this erosion in ways that are difficult to quantify and easy to overlook. The loss of a major skilled employer in a town has effects that radiate outward across decades. The pubs that served the factory shifts close. The shops that supplied the factory families struggle. The young people who would once have served apprenticeships at the factory have to look elsewhere for similar work, often in places they have to move to, often in industries that pay less or offer less stable employment. The town adjusts. It always adjusts, but the adjustment carries a cost that does not appear on any balance sheet. And in Erith, the building stayed for a long time. The signage came down. The car park emptied. The hum stopped. There were periods when the site was used for other purposes, periods when it stood empty, periods when redevelopment plans were proposed and abandoned and proposed again. The physical residue of the factory persisted long after the work it had housed had moved away. Aftermath and legacy. What remains today is complicated. The Vox brand is alive. Korg continues to manufacture amplifiers under the name, and some of them are excellent instruments by any objective standard. The AC30 is still in production, still used by working musicians, still capable of producing the chiming top end that made the original famous. There are signature models, anniversary editions, modern variants with digital features that Dick Denny never dreamed of.
In the boutique sector, a generation of small British and American builders have dedicated themselves to recreating, with obsessive precision, the circuits and components of the original 1960s AC30s. Hand-wound transformers, period-correct capacitors, specific brands of valves sourced from specific countries. There is, in this dedicated corner of the industry, a kind of preservation taking place. But preservation is not production. The originals are now collector's items, traded at prices that would have astonished the men and women who built them. A genuine 1963 AC30 in good condition can change hands for sums that exceed the lifetime earnings of the apprentices who once assembled them. The market has memorialized the craft by making it unaffordable. The amplifiers have become, in effect, financial instruments, assets to be bought and sold, stored in climate-controlled rooms, brought out occasionally to be photographed and resold. The instruments built to be played are increasingly being held to be appreciated. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this. The men and women who built the original AC30s built them for working musicians. They built them to be plugged in, played hard, taken on tour, knocked about, repaired, played again. The fact that their work has now become so valuable that working musicians can no longer afford to use it is a kind of betrayal of the work's original purpose. The amplifiers have been priced out of the hands of the people they were made for. The Erith factory site has been redeveloped, in keeping with the broader pattern of southeast London's deindustrialization, with light industrial and commercial uses replacing what was once a center of skilled manufacturing. There is no major museum dedicated to Vox in Britain. There is no national heritage designation. The story is preserved, mostly, in the enthusiast literature, in the recollections of former employees, and in the amplifiers themselves. Those surviving wooden boxes, with their brass diamonds, still being plugged in, still being played, still producing that sound, more than 60 years since the first one left the factory.
There are individuals who have done remarkable work to keep the memory of British Vox alive. Researchers, collectors, former employees, dedicated journalists in the music equipment press. Books have been written, forums have been built. Restoration specialists have learned to keep the surviving original amplifiers running. The knowledge has not been entirely lost. It has been distributed into the private hands of enthusiasts, where it persists as a kind of underground inheritance. But this is not the same as having a living industry. A living industry is one in which the knowledge is being passed on through paid work, through apprenticeships, through the daily practice of people who do this for a living. A preserved industry, by contrast, is one in which the knowledge is being passed on through hobby, through enthusiasm, through the unpaid effort of dedicated individuals. Both are valuable. Only one is sustainable at scale. The British Vox industry, in its productive sense, has become a preserved industry. The work continues, but it is being done by enthusiasts rather than by employees. There is a temptation in stories like this one to look for a single villain, a bad owner, a cynical decision, a moment of fraud or asset stripping that explains everything. The Vox story does not offer that satisfaction. There were poor decisions, certainly. There was overextension. There was the dilution of the American partnership. There were owners who treated the brand as a financial instrument rather than a cultural institution. But there was no single executioner. The company was not murdered. It was slowly, absent-mindedly, allowed to fade. And perhaps that is the deeper British industrial tragedy, not the dramatic collapses, the front-page bankruptcies, the asset-stripping scandals, but the long, quiet erosions in which something the country had built well and built unrepeatably was simply not valued enough to keep. The Erith factory did not close because nobody wanted Vox amplifiers. The world wanted them. The world still wants them. It closed because the British industrial imagination, by the time the question arrived, no longer believed it was worth the cost of keeping the work at home. This is a pattern that has repeated itself across British manufacturing in the post-war decades, in industry after industry, in town after town. The shoemaking industry of Northamptonshire, the textile mills of Yorkshire and Lancashire, the pottery kilns of Stoke-on-Trent, the shipyards of the Tyne and the Clyde, the car plants of Coventry and Birmingham. The story varies in its specifics, but its shape is depressingly consistent. A British company builds something the world wants. The world buys it. The company becomes successful. The company is sold. The new owners optimize. The work moves. The skills disperse. The town adjusts. The brand survives in some form as a name attached to products made elsewhere by other people. The local memory of the work persists for a generation, then begins to fade. That is the bankruptcy that destroyed Britain's greatest sound. Not the bankruptcy of a balance sheet, though there were several of those. The bankruptcy of attention. The bankruptcy of belief. The slow, accumulated bankruptcy of a country that forgot for a while that the things it made well were worth the trouble of continuing to make them. There is a particular question that the Vox story raises and does not answer. The question is whether any of this was inevitable, whether a country in Britain's economic position, facing the global pressures of the late 19th century, could have realistically kept its small, specialized, craft-based manufacturing alive, whether the offshoring was a failure of policy, a failure of management, a failure of culture, or simply the inescapable working out of economic forces beyond any individual's control. The honest answer is probably that all of these factors played a role, in proportions that historians and economists will continue to argue about for decades. But the answer is also that other countries, Germany, Japan, Italy, Switzerland, managed to keep significant portions of their craft-based manufacturing alive through the same period, by making different choices about industrial policy, about training, about capital investment, about the cultural value placed on skilled manual work. The British failure was not preordained, it was chosen, over and over, by people who could have chosen differently. The amplifiers are still out there, in studios, in attics, on stages in small clubs and large arenas. Plug one in, let the valves warm, strike a chord, and the sound that emerges is the same sound that came out of a workshop in Dartford in 1959. Bright, chiming, unmistakably itself. It is a sound that does not belong to any particular era, because it has outlast every era it has passed through. It is a sound that was good when it was new, and is good now, 60 years on, because the people who built it knew what they were doing and built it to last. It is the sound of what Britain could do when it tried. And the silence around it now, in the empty car park in Erith, is the sound of what happened when it stopped. The hum is gone from the building, but it is not gone from the world. Not yet. There are still working AC30s on stages tonight in cities the original builders never visited, being played by musicians who were not born when the Erith factory closed. The amplifiers are doing what they were built to do. They are being plugged in. They are being warmed up. They are being played. The men and women who built them, most of them now elderly or gone, would recognize the sound immediately if they walked into the room. Whether it survives the next 60 years, whether the craft, the knowledge, the specific British understanding of how a valve amplifier should breathe can outlive the factory that taught it, is a question for another generation. The boutique builders are doing their part. The collectors are doing their part. The musicians who choose, in an age of digital modeling and software emulation, to plug into a real valve amplifier and play through it, are doing their part. The knowledge persists, distributed throughout thousands of dedicated individuals, in a way that no single corporate owner could now extinguish.
But the factory is gone. The workforce is gone. The community of practice that produced the original AC30 is gone. What remains is memory, enthusiasm, careful preservation, and a brand name in the hands of a Japanese company that produces respectable amplifiers in Asian factories. For now,
The diamond on the front of the cabinet is still there. The name is still there. The sound is still there. The country that made it is the part that went missing. And perhaps, in the end, the lesson of Vox is this: a country can lose an industry without noticing. It can lose a craft without mourning. It can lose a community of practice without ever debating the loss. The pieces drift away one at a time, an ownership change here, a factory closure there, a relocation of production, a quiet redundancy package, a brand acquired, a brand sold, a brand made overseas, and at the end of the long sequence of small decisions, the country wakes up to discover that something it once did better than anyone in the world is no longer something it does at all. Vox was Britain's voice, in a literal and a metaphorical sense. It was the voice that the most influential British music of the 20th century spoke through. It was the voice that British engineering used to address the world. It was a voice that the world listened to, copied, treasured, and continues to chase. The voice is still there in the amplifiers themselves. The mouth that made it is closed. In the empty car park in Erith, the weeds continue their slow conquest of the cracked tarmac. The wind moves through the gaps in the fencing. The brickwork ages another year. Somewhere in the distance, a train passes on its way to central London, full of commuters who will probably never know that the building they are passing once produced the soundtrack to their parents' youth. The hum is gone from the building, but the building is still there, and the amplifiers are still out there, and the sound, that bright, chiming, unmistakable sound, is still being made somewhere, every night, by someone who plugged in and let the valves warm and struck the first chord. Britain made that sound. Britain lost the making of it. The sound continues. The making does not. That is the bankruptcy. That is the loss. That is the story of Vox.